The screen flickered once, before the image steadied, and my hands went cold, before my mind understood why. I was standing on the observation deck of the Horizon Line, a small escort vessel parked at the edge of the Assembly's home system, when the feed cut in. My name is Ethan Cole, and at that moment I was nothing more than a communications officer, 26 years old, 3 cups of stale coffee into a quiet shift. Nothing about that day was supposed to matter. Then the feed showed me Elena Voss, kneeling on a platform of black stone, surrounded by a ring of tall, silver-robed judges from a dozen different worlds. I had met her twice, once at a briefing where she shook my hand and remembered my name a week later. Once in a hallway, where she laughed at something I said and told me humanity needed more people who could still laugh under pressure. She was 51 years old, sharp as a blade, and the closest thing our species had to a symbol of hope in a galaxy that still called us the newcomers. The judges were reading a verdict. I did not understand every word of their language, but the translation crawled along the bottom of the screen, cold and clinical. Cultural contamination, destabilizing influence, a threat to the natural order of lesser societies. I remember laughing, actually laughing, because it sounded so absurd, like a bad translation error, like something that could not possibly be the actual charge against a diplomat who had spent 6 years building bridges between species that had never once agreed on anything. Then I saw her face. She was not afraid. She looked directly into the recording drone hovering above her, and for one heartbeat, I could have sworn she was looking straight through the screen at me. The sentence carried out on that platform is not something I will describe. Some images do not need to be repeated to be remembered. What I will say is that it took less than a minute, that the judges did not hesitate, and that when it was finished, they turned back to their business, as if nothing of consequence had happened at all. The feed cut. The silence on our bridge was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Captain Whitfield did not shout orders. She did not slam her fist on the console or curse into the open comm channel the way I expected. She simply stood very still, staring at the black screen, and said one word. Confirmed. That was all. Confirmed. Like she was checking off an item on a list she had hoped never to use. Word spread through our ship faster than any official channel could carry it. I watched grown men and women, veterans of nothing but simulated drills and peacekeeping patrols, go quiet, in a way that frightened me more than shouting would have. There is a kind of silence that comes from shock, and there is a kind that comes from decision. This was the second kind. Within the hour, every screen on the Horizon Line switched to the same feed from Earth. Not a news broadcast, not a statement from a president or a prime minister. Just a single black screen with white text, sent to every ship, every station, every colony humanity had ever built among the stars. We have received confirmation. We are proceeding accordingly. Nothing else. No calls for calm. No promises of justice through proper channels. No outrage, no tears, no declarations of grief broadcast for sympathy. Just those 12 words, repeating on a loop, and beneath them, a countdown that had already begun, before most of us even understood what it meant. I asked Whitfield what proceeding accordingly meant. She looked at me the way you look at someone who is about to learn something you already know and wish you didn't. It means the treaties are void, she said. It means every restriction we agreed to is gone. It means the people who run this galaxy just made the worst mistake in the short history of our species knowing them. I did not understand yet how right she was. Outside our hull, I noticed something strange happening among the ships from other species docked nearby. A trade vessel from the Kolru Directorate, usually loud on open comms with requests for docking priority, went completely silent. A diplomatic cruiser from the Vesenar Accord began quietly repositioning itself, engines warming, as if preparing to leave without formal clearance. Word had reached them too, and whatever they knew about humanity that we did not yet fully understand ourselves, it was enough to make them nervous. I remember asking one of our sensor techs, a young woman named Priya Malhotra, why everyone else seemed more frightened than we were. She gave me a strange smile, the kind that did not reach her eyes. Because they've seen our old wars, she said. The ones from before we ever left our own solar system. They studied every conflict on Earth's history like it was a warning label. And now they think we're about to remember all of it at once. I laughed again, nervously this time, because I did not think humanity had anything left to remember. We had spent generations building a peaceful, unified world, Old borders had softened. Old rivalries had faded into history books and museum exhibits. I had grown up believing that version of humanity, the peaceful one, the one that shook hands instead of raising fists, was simply who we were now. I did not yet understand that peace, for humanity, had always been a choice, not an absence of capability. We had simply chosen, for a long time, not to remind anyone what waited beneath the surface. Captain Whitfield called the crew together in the main hold less than 2 hours after the broadcast. She stood in front of us, calm, steady, her voice carrying, without needing to be raised. "I know most of you are frightened," she said. "I know some of you are angry. I need you to understand something clearly, because what happens next will move fast, and there will not be time to explain it twice." Ambassador Voss was not just a diplomat, she was chosen, deliberately, because she represented everything we hoped this galaxy could become for us. A place where we did not need to be feared to be respected. That hope is not gone. But the people who ended her life have shown every species watching exactly how much our patience and our restraint are worth to them. Nothing. She paused, letting that settle over the room. "We are not going to war because we are furious," she continued. "Fury fades. We are going to war because there has to be a cost for what happened today, or there will be nothing stopping it from happening again, to someone else, on some other platform, in some other system, the next time a species decides humanity is small enough to make an example of." Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. I looked around that hold and saw faces I had known for months look suddenly unfamiliar, hardened in a way I had never seen on any of them before. It was not hatred on their faces. It was resolve, and somehow, that was far more unsettling. Later that night, alone in my quarters, I pulled up everything I could find about Elena Voss's early career. I wanted to understand who she really was before she became a symbol, before her death became the reason an entire species reorganized itself in a single afternoon. I found interviews from years earlier, before her appointment, when she was still a relatively unknown negotiator working minor trade disputes between colonies. In one recording, a young reporter asked her why she wanted the ambassador role so badly, given how dangerous the political climate already was for humanity's first official representative to the wider galaxy. She smiled in the recording, the same warm smile I remembered from the hallway, and said something I have not been able to forget since. "Somebody has to go first," she said. "Somebody has to prove we can be trusted, before anyone will trust us. I would rather it be me than someone unprepared for what that might cost." I sat with that sentence for a long time. She had known. Not the specifics, not the exact platform, or the exact judges, or the exact charge, but she had understood, on some level, that the price of being first could be everything. I turned off the recording and stared at the ceiling of my quarters for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the ship's systems shifting into a configuration I did not recognize. Somewhere above me, engineers were rerouting power. Somewhere below me, weapon systems that had sat dormant since the ship's launch were coming fully online for the first time. I did not sleep that night. I do not think anyone on that ship did. By morning, the countdown on every screen across human space had reached 0, and the silence that followed felt less like an ending, and more like the space between a held breath and the moment it finally releases. I did not know yet what humanity was capable of. Nobody outside our solar system did, not truly, not after decades of careful diplomacy, designed to make us look smaller than we were. But I understood, standing on that deck as the countdown vanished from the screen, that the galaxy was about to find out, and that nothing about the next chapter of our story would be quiet, careful, or restrained, ever again. 3 days after the broadcast, I was ordered home. Not home to the Horizon Line's assigned station, not home to some forward base near the Assembly's territory, but home to Earth itself, a place I had not set foot on in almost 2 years. I did not know why until my transport dropped out of the higher lanes, and I saw the planet through the viewport, and even then, it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. I had expected panic. I had expected the kind of chaos you see in old disaster records, crowded evacuation routes, overwhelmed emergency broadcasts, people running without direction because no one had told them where to go. That is not what I found. What I found was something far stranger, and in its own way, far more unsettling. Earth was calm. Earth was organized. Earth was, in a way I had never witnessed in my entire life, awake. The transport brought me down over what used to be a quiet coastal town near where I grew up, and even from altitude I could see the changes. Fields that had been left to grow wild for decades, converted back to agriculture almost overnight. Old manufacturing districts, the kind my grandparents used to talk about from history lessons, lit up and running at full capacity, smoke and steam rising from chimneys that had been silent since before I was born. I remember pressing my hand against the viewport glass, trying to reconcile the peaceful, sleepy world I remembered with the version unfolding beneath me now. My mother met me at the transport station. She hugged me the way she always had, tight and quick, like she was afraid I would disappear if she held on too long. But there was something different in her eyes, something I had never seen in her before. She had spent her whole life as a teacher, gentle, patient, endlessly calm even when I was an impossible teenager testing every boundary I could find. Now she looked at me with the focus of someone preparing for a fight she had been quietly expecting her entire life. They called up the registry, she told me on the drive home. Not just active service. Everyone. Retired officers, reserve engineers, medical staff who left the service decades ago. Your Uncle Gerald reported for duty yesterday. He is 68 years old, Ethan. He said he has been waiting for this call since before you were born. I did not know what to say to that. I had grown up believing my uncle's old stories about military service were exaggerations, the kind of thing older relatives tell to seem more interesting at family gatherings. I did not understand yet how many of those stories were true, or how much of humanity's older generation had spent their entire peaceful lives quietly prepared for a day exactly like this one. Over the following days, I began to understand the shape of what was happening. Earth was not simply reacting to Elena Voss's death. It was executing a plan, one that had clearly existed for a very long time, tucked away in contingency archives that most citizens never knew existed. I met with a debriefing officer named Grace Whitfield, no relation to my captain despite the shared name, a coincidence that struck me as strange in a week when very little still felt random. She explained, with the patience of someone repeating information she had already delivered 100 times that week, exactly what had been set into motion. When we first made contact with the wider galaxy, she told me, we quickly learned that most species out there judge strength by visible capability. Ships, weapons, fleet size, all of it observable, all of it measurable. So Earth made a decision early on. We would show them exactly enough capability to be taken seriously, as a species worth negotiating with, and not one measure more. We held back, deliberately, for decades. I asked her why. It seemed strange to me that a species eager to build peaceful relationships would deliberately hide its own strength. Because strength invites challenge, she said. A species that reveals everything it has becomes a target for anyone looking to test their own strength against it. A species that reveals just enough to be respected, while keeping the rest hidden, becomes something else entirely, something unpredictable, something other species hesitate to provoke, because they cannot calculate exactly what they would be provoking. It made a grim kind of sense to me, though it also unsettled me in ways I could not fully articulate. I had spent my entire adult life believing I understood my own species, its history, its capabilities, its place among the stars. I was beginning to realize how much of that understanding had been carefully curated, not out of dishonesty, but out of caution, a caution that had apparently just run out of reasons to continue. I spent the following week moving through facilities I had never known existed, tucked beneath old cities, hidden inside mountain ranges that tourists once hiked without any idea what lay beneath their boots. Shipyards that had been quietly expanding production for years under civilian cover designations. Training programs that had continued running long after most citizens assumed humanity's military had scaled down to nothing more than a peacekeeping formality. In one facility outside what used to be called the Ural region, I watched engineers uncover and reactivate a fleet of vessels that had been built decades earlier, and then deliberately mothballed, hidden from any external inspection, maintained just enough to remain functional the moment they were needed again. An older engineer named Marcus Lindquist walked me through rows of dormant hulls, explaining with quiet pride how each one had been designed specifically to be underestimated. We built these to look outdated on the outside, he told me, running his hand along a hull plate that looked, admittedly, unimpressive. Old paint, simple markings, nothing that would draw attention during any external survey. But everything underneath, the engines, the shielding, the weapons architecture, that is a full generation ahead of anything we ever let the Assembly's inspectors see. They looked at ships like this one and assumed we were still catching up to the rest of the galaxy. We let them believe that. It cost us nothing, and it bought us everything we needed for a day like today. I asked him how long he had known this day might come. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. Since the day we signed our first treaty with the Assembly, he said. Every species we have ever met out there has a history of conquest somewhere in their past. Even the peaceful ones. Even the ones who claim otherwise now. We hoped that history would not repeat itself with us. But hope is not a strategy. So while our diplomats extended their hands in friendship, the rest of us made sure that hand was never the only thing we had ready. I found myself both comforted and disturbed by that explanation, and I suspect that contradiction was exactly the point. The most striking transformation I witnessed during those days was not military at all. It was social. I watched neighborhoods that had spent years, quietly divided by old political disagreements, come together, almost overnight, setting aside disputes that had felt permanent only weeks earlier. I watched public volunteer stations overwhelmed not with panic, but with organization. Ordinary citizens lining up to offer labor, medical training, logistics experience, anything at all that might be useful. There was no single leader shouting instructions through a megaphone. There did not need to be. It was as though something long dormant in the collective memory of an entire species had simply woken up, remembered exactly what to do, and gotten quietly, efficiently, to work. I called Priya, still stationed aboard the Horizon line, to describe what I was seeing. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "You know what worries me," she finally said. "It is not that Earth is preparing for war. It is how calm everyone is while they do it. There is no shouting, no blind rage, just people doing exactly what needs to be done, one task at a time, like they always knew this moment was coming, and simply had to wait for the signal." I thought about Elena Voss's words from that old recording, about being the first, about proving humanity could be trusted before demanding trust in return. I wondered if she had understood, even then, what would happen if that trust was ever broken so completely, so publicly, so without hesitation. On my final night on Earth before returning to active duty, my mother sat with me on the porch of our old house, the same porch where I used to do homework as a child, while she graded papers beside me. The night sky above us was clear, full of stars I had once dreamed of traveling toward, with nothing but excitement and curiosity. Now those same stars felt heavier, weighted with everything that was about to unfold beneath them. "Are you afraid?" she asked me. I told her the truth. I was terrified. "Good," she said, surprising me. "Fear means you understand what is at stake. Just do not let it decide anything for you." Elena did not let her fear decide anything, right up until the very end. That is the part of her story people are going to remember, long after everything else about this is finished. I did not sleep well that night either, but for a different reason than before. I no longer felt like a passenger caught in events far beyond my understanding. I felt, for the first time since watching that broadcast on the Horizon Line's bridge, like part of something my entire species had apparently been quietly building toward, for far longer than I had ever realized. The following morning, my transport orders arrived. I was being reassigned, not back to my old post, but to a mobilizing fleet forming near the outer edge of our solar system, a fleet larger than anything I had ever seen depicted in any official record of humanity's military capability. I packed my bag, said goodbye to my mother on the same porch where we had talked the night before, and stepped back into a sky that no longer felt distant or peaceful, but instead felt like the opening line of a story the entire galaxy was about to be forced to read, whether it wanted to or not. The staging point near the edge of our solar system did not look like anything I had imagined during the transport ride out. I had pictured a handful of cruisers, maybe a few dozen support vessels, a modest show of force meant to signal seriousness without overcommitting. What I found instead, when my shuttle finally cleared the last debris field and the fleet came into view, made me forget how to breathe for several seconds. Ships stretched across my field of vision in every direction, more than I could count, arranged in formations that seemed to fade into the darkness the farther out my eyes tried to follow them. Some were massive, slow-moving structures that looked more like floating cities than warships. Others were small and fast, darting between the larger vessels in coordinated patterns that reminded me of schools of fish moving as a single organism. I had spent my entire career believing I understood the scale of humanity's military presence among the stars. I understood, in that moment, that I had understood almost nothing. I was assigned to a mid-sized command vessel called the Aldergrove, under the authority of a fleet captain named Owen Marsh, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a quiet, measured way of speaking that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. My first meeting with him took place in a briefing room, crowded with officers from a dozen different specialties, all called together for what he described simply as an orientation on reality. Marsh stood at the front of the room, a holographic display behind him showing the full scope of the mobilizing fleet, far larger than anything visible from any single viewport. Most of you grew up believing our fleet was primarily defensive, he began. That belief was intentional, and it was also technically true. We built this fleet to defend something. We simply never specified what that something was. Some of you assumed it meant our solar system. It did not. It meant our right to exist among the stars without being treated as an experiment other species could end whenever it became politically convenient. He gestured, and the display shifted to show a formal document, dense with diplomatic language, dated decades earlier. This is the founding charter of what we now call the Reserve Fleet Program, he continued, signed by every major nation on Earth before any of us had ever left our own solar system. It established a simple principle. We would show the galaxy a fraction of our true capability, maintain peaceful relationships built on that limited presentation, and continue developing the rest in careful secrecy, hoping we would never need to reveal it. That hope ended 3 days ago. A murmur moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable. I felt it too, a strange mixture of pride and unease, the sense of learning something your entire life had been built around without ever knowing it. Marsh continued, walking us through the formal declaration that had already been transmitted to every species in the wider galaxy, the same one I had first glimpsed on that black screen aboard the horizon line. He explained that Earth's leadership had made a deliberate choice in how that declaration was delivered. No demands. No list of grievances presented for negotiation. No opportunity for the Assembly to offer an apology or a settlement in exchange for de-escalation. They wanted us to negotiate, Marsh said. They wanted a formal complaint, a diplomatic protest, something they could manage through the same channels that had always worked on every other species they had ever intimidated into compliance. We did not give them that opportunity. We gave them a countdown, because a countdown cannot be negotiated with. It can only be respected or ignored, and either way, it tells you everything about the character of the people who set it. I raised my hand, surprising myself, and asked what would happen when the countdown reached its end. Marsh looked directly at me for a long moment before answering. It already has, he said. What happens next is not a mystery, Officer Cole. It is a demonstration. The Assembly needs to understand, in terms they cannot misinterpret or explain away to their own citizens, exactly what kind of mistake they made when they decided our ambassador's life was worth less than a show of dominance over a species they assumed would remain quiet and grateful forever. Over the following days, I learned the full outline of what Earth intended to do, delivered in careful stages during briefings that grew progressively more detailed as trust in our discretion increased. The strategy was not one of conquest. Marsh was clear about that, repeatedly, in a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. Earth had no interest in claiming territory, subjugating populations, or replacing the Assembly's authority with its own. What Earth wanted was narrower, and, in its own way, far more precise. Accountability, Marsh explained during one late briefing, delivered to a smaller group of officers, gathered around a tactical display, showing the Assembly's central territories. Not vague accountability, delivered through some future tribunal that will inevitably be delayed, diluted, and eventually forgotten. Immediate, undeniable, permanent accountability. Every leader who voted for that execution, every judge who presided over it, every official who could have intervened and chose silence instead, they will answer for that choice, directly, without the shelter of committees or diplomatic immunity. I asked how Earth intended to accomplish something so specific without descending into exactly the kind of broad, indiscriminate conflict that would make us no better than the species we were confronting. Discipline, Marsh answered simply. That is the entire difference between what we are doing and what a lesser response would look like. We are not attacking civilian populations. We are not targeting species who had no part in what happened. Our engagement rules are narrower and stricter than anything the Assembly itself has ever operated under. We know exactly who made that decision, and we know exactly where to find them. Everyone else in this galaxy has a choice to make, and that choice is entirely their own. Over the following 2 weeks, I watched that discipline take shape in ways that both reassured and unsettled me. Intelligence officers worked around the clock, identifying the specific judges, the specific council members, the specific military commanders, who had either ordered or enabled Elena Voss's execution. Diplomatic teams, working alongside the fleet rather than replaced by it, continued reaching out to neutral and allied species, offering clear reassurance that this was not a war against the galaxy at large, but a reckoning, aimed with precision, at those directly responsible. I began to understand, during long shifts monitoring communications traffic from neighboring systems, just how effective this approach was at unsettling the wider galactic community. Species who had spent decades treating humanity as an interesting but ultimately manageable newcomer were now scrambling to reassess everything they thought they knew about us. Some sent formal messages of condolence, distancing themselves publicly from the Assembly's decision. Others, more cautious, simply went quiet, waiting to see how this would unfold before committing to any position at all. I intercepted one message, forwarded through several relay stations, from a minor species called the Thren, historically aligned closely with the Assembly's central authority. The message was brief, addressed generally to any human official willing to receive it, and it stayed with me long after I first read it. "We did not know your restraint had limits," it read. "We assumed patience without end was simply your nature. We understand now that patience is not the same as weakness, and we understand, too late for some of us, that we should have asked what your patience was protecting, rather than assuming it meant nothing was there at all." I showed that message to Priya during one of our brief comm exchanges between shifts. She read it twice before responding. "That is the part they never understood about us," she said. "Every single species out there built their entire understanding of humanity from what we chose to show them. Nobody ever stopped to consider that a species capable of building something this disciplined, this coordinated, this quietly patient for decades, was never going to be the version of us they assumed they were dealing with." As the fleet finished its final preparations, Captain Marsh called us together one last time, before the formal engagement phase began. He did not deliver a rousing speech filled with promises of glory or vengeance. Instead, he spoke plainly, the way he always did, and something about that plainness felt more powerful than any grand declaration could have. "Some of you are going to face difficult decisions in the days ahead," he said. "Moments where restraint will feel impossible to maintain, where the desire to make someone else feel exactly what we felt watching that broadcast will be almost overwhelming. I need every one of you to remember why we are doing this, not because we wanted a war, not because we enjoy the idea of galactic dominance. We are doing this because Elena Voss believed, right up until her final moment, that humanity could earn its place among the stars through patience and integrity. We owe it to her memory to prove that even now, in the middle of a war we did not choose, that belief was not misplaced." I thought about my mother's words on that porch, about fear not being allowed to decide anything. I thought about Marcus Lindquist's quiet pride walking me through rows of dormant ships built to be underestimated. I thought about Elena Voss's calm expression in that old recording, insisting that somebody had to go first. As the Alder Grove and the rest of the fleet began their final approach toward the outer edge of Assembly territory, I stood at my station, steadier than I had felt in weeks, and watched the stars ahead of us shift from distant points of light into something that finally felt within reach. Whatever waited for us on the other side of that approach, I understood now that humanity was not walking into it blindly, or out of anger alone. We were walking into it, the way Elena Voss had always insisted we should approach everything, with clear purpose, careful discipline, and an unshakable belief that doing this the right way mattered every bit as much as doing it at all. The first engagement did not begin the way I expected. I had spent weeks bracing myself for chaos, for the kind of confusion and noise I had seen in old training simulations, alarms blaring, contradictory orders shouted across a crowded bridge. Instead, when the Aldergrove finally crossed into contested territory near a border station called Keth Vantar, everything unfolded with an eerie, practiced calm that felt almost more unsettling than panic would have. Captain Marsh stood at the center of the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, watching the tactical display update in real time as our forward scout ships reported contact with a defensive fleet stationed to protect the station. The enemy formation, I noticed immediately, was arranged the way I had come to expect from years of studying assembly military doctrine, wide and spread out, built for slow, deliberate posturing rather than rapid, coordinated engagement. It was a formation designed for a kind of warfare that had not truly existed in this part of the galaxy for generations. A formation built by people who had never needed to fight for anything that mattered. Our formation was different. Tight, layered, every vessel positioned with a specific purpose relative to every other vessel around it. The entire fleet moving less like a collection of individual ships and more like a single, coordinated organism. I watched Marsh issue a series of quiet, almost casual instructions, and watched the fleet respond instantly, shifting formation with a precision that made my chest tighten with something between pride and disbelief. "They are requesting communication," our comms officer reported, a steady woman named Fiona Bright who had barely looked up from her station in over an hour. Marsh nodded. "Open the channel." The image that appeared on our main display showed an assembly commander, an older being from a species called the Ordesi, tall and pale, with an expression that mixed confusion and irritation in equal measure. "This border is under the protection of the assembly," the commander said, his translated voice carrying a clipped, impatient edge. "Withdraw your fleet immediately, or you will be considered a hostile incursion." Marsh studied him for a long moment before responding, his tone perfectly level. "We are aware of the assembly's claim to this border," he said. "We are also aware that you personally authorized reinforcement of the judicial platform where Ambassador Elena Voss was executed 11 days ago. This is not an incursion. This is a reckoning, and you are one of the names on our list." The commander's expression shifted from irritation to something closer to genuine alarm, and for the first time, I understood exactly how effective our intelligence gathering had been. This was not a random target selected for strategic convenience. This was someone specifically identified, specifically responsible, specifically named. I will not describe in detail what followed over the next several hours, because the details themselves are not what matters most about that engagement. What matters is the discipline I witnessed, the same discipline Marsh had promised us during that final briefing. Our fleet targeted only military assets directly involved in defending the station's command structure. Civilian transports were allowed safe passage out of the contested zone before engagement began, a courtesy our scout ships extended without hesitation despite the tactical advantage it cost us. Support stations providing medical or humanitarian services were left entirely untouched, marked clearly on every ship's tactical display as protected zones under no circumstances to be engaged. I found myself thinking, more than once during that long, tense stretch of hours, about something Marsh had said. Discipline is the entire difference. I watched that discipline hold, engagement after engagement, even when it would have been easier, faster, simpler to abandon it entirely. By the end of that first day, Keth Vantar's defensive fleet had been neutralized, its command structure removed from any position of continued authority, and the station itself transferred to a temporary human administrative presence, with clear public assurances broadcast to the surrounding systems that civilian operations would continue uninterrupted. The commander who had threatened us over open comms only hours earlier was, I later learned, among those held accountable directly, exactly as Marsh had promised. Word of what happened at Keth Vantar spread quickly through the wider galactic community, and the reaction, as I monitored incoming communications traffic over the following days, was not what I expected. I had assumed outrage, condemnation, perhaps even a unified response from other species eager to defend the Assembly's authority. Instead, what I found was something closer to careful, nervous reassessment. A formal statement arrived from a coalition of smaller species who had long existed on the periphery of Assembly influence, historically too weak or too politically insignificant to have any real voice in galactic affairs. Their statement, broadcast openly rather than through private diplomatic channels, expressed something I had not expected to hear from anyone outside our own fleet. "We have watched the Assembly's authority for generations," it read, without ever daring to question whether that authority was earned or simply assumed. What humanity has shown in recent days is not simply military capability. It is the willingness to hold power accountable, something our own systems abandoned believing in long ago. We do not celebrate conflict, but we recognize, for the first time in a long while, the possibility that the current order might not be as permanent as we once believed. I read that statement 3 times before showing it to Priya, who had transferred alongside part of our support fleet and was now stationed only a few decks below mine, aboard the Aldergrove. "They are not afraid of us," she said, studying the message carefully. "Not really. They are afraid of what our discipline is revealing about everyone else who never had it." Over the following 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself across a handful of additional engagements, each one narrower in scope than the last, each one focused precisely on identified individuals and command structures directly connected to Elena Voss's execution, rather than broad territorial conquest. I began to understand that this restraint was, in its own way, the most powerful weapon humanity possessed. Every engagement that avoided unnecessary harm, every civilian population left untouched, every protected station respected exactly as promised, built a kind of credibility that no amount of raw military strength could have purchased on its own. Not every moment during those weeks was calm or controlled. I remember one specific night, monitoring communications during a tense standoff near a heavily fortified command world called Saravash Prime, when our forward scouts reported that the local commander had deliberately positioned civilian infrastructure directly alongside military targets, apparently hoping to discourage engagement or to manufacture an incident that could be used to paint humanity as reckless and indiscriminate. Marsh's response to that report was immediate and unwavering. He ordered a full halt to any offensive action near Saravash Prime until alternative approaches could be developed, even as pressure mounted from some officers eager to press the advantage while it existed. I watched him personally review revised tactical plans late into the night, alongside our engineering teams, searching for any approach that could neutralize the military threat, without endangering the civilians deliberately placed in harm's way. "We do not become what we are fighting against," he said quietly, during a briefing where several frustrated officers questioned the delay. "Not for speed, not for convenience, not even when the enemy is counting on our restraint to slow us down. If we abandon that principle now, everything we have built over these past weeks means nothing." It took an additional 4 days, longer than any previous engagement, but the final operation at Saravash Prime succeeded exactly as intended, with the responsible command structure removed from power, and not a single civilian casualty reported. I remember the quiet relief that moved through the Aldergrove's bridge when that confirmation arrived, a relief that felt different from any celebration I had witnessed during earlier, faster victories. This one felt earned, in a way the others had not quite managed. News of Saravash Prime spread even faster than Keth Vantar had, and this time, the reaction shifted noticeably. Several mid-tier species, previously cautious about openly aligning with either side, began quietly reaching out through diplomatic channels, offering limited cooperation, sharing intelligence about assembly troop movements, even providing safe passage through territories that had previously been closed to any outside fleet. I remember Fiona Bright reading one such message aloud during a quiet shift, a formal offer of alliance from a species called the Anvedri, historically neutral in nearly every galactic conflict for over 2 centuries. "We do not offer this lightly," the message read. "We have watched carefully, and what we have seen is not a species seeking conquest, but a species seeking justice through the narrowest possible path available to it. We would rather stand beside that kind of resolve than wait to see what remains of the old order once this is finished." Marsh read the message himself, standing quietly at the center of the bridge for a long moment before responding. "Send our thanks," he said, "and remind them, clearly, that this alliance comes with the same expectations we hold ourselves to. No shortcuts, no compromises on how this is conducted. If they cannot commit to that, their support is not worth the risk it introduces." I found myself during those long weeks, thinking often about Elena Voss, about her insistence that somebody had to go first, that trust had to be earned before it could be expected in return. I understood now, more clearly than I ever had before, that her death had not simply triggered a war, it had triggered a test. One humanity was determined to pass, not through overwhelming force alone, but through the discipline to use that force exactly as far as justice required, and not one step further. As our fleet prepared for what intelligence reports suggested would be the final major engagement, a direct approach toward the Assembly's central seat of power, I stood once again at my station aboard the Aldergrove, watching the stars ahead shift and settle into a new formation. I no longer felt like the frightened officer who had watched that first broadcast on the horizon line, unable to fully understand what was happening around me. I felt like someone who finally understood exactly what his species was capable of, not simply as a weapon, but as a promise, one Elena Voss had made with her life, and one every person aboard this fleet was now determined to keep. The approach toward the Assembly's central seat of power took 11 days, and I remember every one of them with a clarity that has never faded, even now, years later, as I sit down to finally put this account into words, for anyone who might want to understand what really happened during that time, beyond the official records and the carefully worded historical summaries that followed. The Central World, called Ovresa by those who governed it, had never in its long history faced a direct approach from an outside fleet. Its defenses were ancient, layered, built over centuries by a civilization that had grown so accustomed to unquestioned authority that it had never seriously prepared for the possibility of being challenged. I watched, from my station aboard the Aldergrove, as our combined fleet, now reinforced by several allied ships from the Envedri, and two smaller species who had joined our cause in the preceding weeks, approached that world with the same discipline that had defined every engagement before it. Captain Marsh received a formal transmission 3 hours before our fleet reached firing range, this one different from anything the Assembly had sent before. It was not a threat, not a demand for withdrawal, not the confident dismissal we had grown used to, hearing from their commanders in the early days of the conflict. It was a request for immediate negotiation, delivered by a council representative whose voice trembled with something I recognized instantly as genuine fear. Marsh accepted the transmission on the main display, and I watched a thin, silver-robed figure appear, flanked by several others who stood slightly behind, clearly uncertain of their own authority in that moment. "We wish to discuss terms," the representative said, immediately and without further conflict. Marsh's response was calm, measured, exactly as it had been during every engagement I had witnessed since Keth Vantar. "We are prepared to discuss terms," he said. "But understand clearly, this is not a negotiation between equals meeting to compromise. This is an opportunity for you to demonstrate, through your actions, that the Assembly's remaining leadership understands exactly what was broken the day Ambassador Voss was executed, and exactly what will be required to begin repairing it." The representative hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Over the following 2 days, a formal exchange took place, conducted primarily by Earth's remaining diplomatic corps, working in close coordination with Marsh's fleet command. I was not present for the direct negotiations, but I followed the developments closely through internal briefings, and what emerged over those 2 days reshaped the entire structure of the Assembly's governance in ways I do not think anyone, on either side, had fully anticipated at the start of the conflict. Every judge who had presided over Elena Voss's execution was formally removed from office and handed over for accountability, exactly as Marsh had promised weeks earlier. Several senior council members who had either ordered the execution or failed to intervene when they held the authority to do so faced the same fate. The Assembly's leadership, what remained of it, agreed to a complete restructuring of its governing council, one that would, for the first time in its long history, include a permanent, fully empowered seat for humanity, not as a junior member granted limited privileges, but as an equal participant with full voting authority on every matter the council addressed. I remember reading the final terms during a briefing aboard the Aldergrove and feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph or vengeance. Earth had not demanded territory. It had not demanded tribute or resources or expanded influence beyond what justice required. It had demanded accountability, equality, and a guarantee that no species, however small or however new to the galactic community, would ever again be treated as disposable simply because it lacked the visible strength to defend itself. The final term, added at Earth's specific insistence, was the one that stayed with me longest. A memorial, constructed on Ovresa itself, visible from orbit, dedicated to Elena Voss, inscribed not with words of vengeance or condemnation, but with the same sentiment she had expressed in that old recording I had found during my first days back on Earth. Somebody has to go first. Somebody has to prove trust before trust can be expected in return. Let this memorial remind everyone who looks upon it what that trust costs when it is broken, and what it can build when it is finally honored. I traveled down to Ovresa myself, several months later, once the immediate transition of power had stabilized, and Earth's new diplomatic presence had been formally established. I stood before that memorial, a tall, simple structure, built from materials gathered from a dozen different worlds, a quiet symbol of the alliance that had ultimately grown from the very conflict meant to prevent one from ever forming. I thought about the young officer who had watched that first broadcast aboard the Horizon line, terrified and disbelieving, and I thought about how far that journey had carried not just me, but my entire species. Priya joined me there, having also chosen to remain in the region as part of Earth's ongoing diplomatic mission. We stood together in silence for a long while before she finally spoke. "Do you think she would be satisfied with how this ended?" she asked. I considered the question carefully before answering. "I think she would be satisfied that it ended with something built, rather than something destroyed," I said. "I think that is exactly what she would have wanted, if she had ever been given the choice." In the years that followed, I watched humanity's role among the stars shift in ways that would have seemed impossible before the conflict began. Species who had once treated us with cautious condescension now sought our counsel directly, recognizing in our conduct throughout the war something rare and valuable, a willingness to hold immense power, while still choosing restraint whenever restraint was possible. Our seat on the newly restructured council carried real weight, not because we had demanded it through force alone, but because we had demonstrated, through every difficult decision made during those weeks of conflict, that we understood the responsibility that came with the strength we had revealed. I eventually left active fleet service, choosing instead to work within Earth's expanding diplomatic corps, drawn by a sense of purpose I had first discovered standing beside Elena Voss's memorial, on a world that had once been the site of her execution. I often think back to that porch conversation with my mother, the night before I returned to active duty, when she told me that fear was not something to let decide anything for me. I understand now, more fully than I did then, that the same could be said of anger, of grief, of every difficult emotion humanity carried through that conflict. We let none of them decide our actions alone. We let discipline, purpose, and a stubborn insistence on doing things the right way guide us instead, even when the easier path would have asked far less of us. The galaxy remembers humanity differently now, not as a curious newcomer to be cautiously tolerated, but as a species that proved, through the hardest possible test, exactly what it meant when it first extended a hand in friendship all those years earlier. That hand had never been offered out of weakness. It had simply been offered first, patiently, deliberately, by a species willing to wait as long as necessary for the rest of the galaxy to understand what that patience was actually protecting. I do not know what challenges still wait for us among the stars. I suspect there will be more, because peace, real peace, is rarely permanent in any history worth remembering. But I carry with me now something I did not fully possess before that first broadcast changed everything, a quiet confidence in exactly who my species is, and exactly what we are capable of when something we value is threatened without cause. Somebody had to go first. Elena Voss understood that better than anyone, and she paid the highest possible price to prove it. What humanity built afterward, out of grief, out of discipline, out of a refusal to let cruelty go unanswered, became the clearest possible answer to a question the galaxy had been asking about us since the very first day we arrived among the stars. We were never small. We were only ever patient, and now, at last, the entire galaxy finally understands exactly why.